This is Product by Design, a podcast by Prodigy, where we explore technology, artificial intelligence, user experience, product management, and the philosophy of building products and companies. All right, welcome to another episode of Product by Design. I am Kyle, and this week we have another awesome guest with us, Shirish Nadkarni. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited to talk to you. Let me give a brief intro for you, and then you can tell us a little bit more about yourself. But Shirish is a serial entrepreneur who's founded several companies and worked on some critical products for some of the biggest companies in technology. He's also a writer, and we'll talk a little bit more about the book as well, Winner Takes All, which I finished reading in the last couple of days, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But with that, Shirish, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a native of Seattle. I've been in Seattle for the last 35 years. I started my career at Microsoft in the days of MS-DOS, if you can believe it. This was 1987. I worked for Microsoft for about 12 years, did some exciting things like the acquisition of Hotmail and launching MSN.com. And then I started a 15-year entrepreneurial journey where I started 3 companies, had 2 exits out of that, and I've had the opportunity to work with some really smart people and also see kind of industry transformation over time from PCs to internet, mobile, now AI. So I've been very lucky to have participated in some of those trends.
That's an incredible background, and we'll touch on some of it. And I feel like we could probably spend hours kind of diving into some of the experience. But before we do, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you like to do outside of the office or outside of some of the work that you're doing?
Well, I'm a huge tennis fan. I watch tennis almost every day. Right now, I'm watching Wimbledon, which is going on in London as we speak. And then also like to play tennis. Play about 2-3 times a week.
That's great. I absolutely love tennis. It's definitely one of my favorite sports as well. So that's awesome. Well, I want to dive into some of the things in your background, a number of things that you've been writing about and thinking about, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about your journey and what was it like in the early days of Microsoft in very, you don't have to dive too much into it, but what was that like? And then what eventually led you to pursue some of the entrepreneurial things that you did and then eventually writing?
Yes, you bet. So I joined Microsoft in 1987. 1 year after they went IPO, they were still a very small company, about 1,500 employees or so. And I was assigned the job of being the product manager for Microsoft Mail. And just to give you some context, at that time, local area networks were just starting to be prevalent in offices. It was that early. I mean, we now take networking for granted, but that was when local area networks were being, you started seeing them in corporations. And we felt that email was a critical application to take advantage of local area networks. I then had the opportunity to work on development tools and then MSN, where I did the acquisition of Hotmail. And that was what really inspired me to do my own startup, because Hotmail was started by 2 founders. The simple idea to provide web-based email, free email accounts to folks, and it grew very rapidly. Very simple idea, as I said, but enormous appeal. So I felt actually that there was an opportunity to create something similar, but for small businesses, because small businesses have some additional needs in terms of security and administration and so forth. And so that was my original idea that I started off with. And then over time, we pivoted to mobile email as BlackBerry became available, and you had cellular devices with data connectivity and so forth. So that was a little bit of some history about Microsoft and how I got into becoming an entrepreneur.
That's great. And so interesting. Is there, as you've kind of looked over the course of technology over the last 30 years, what has been maybe the most interesting thing to you, or maybe the biggest change as we've kind of progressed from, like you were saying, the very early days of email and even just local area networks in offices to where we are now?
I mean, some of the key trends that I was able to leverage, was the internet and then mobile. And that kind of culminated with the formation of my first company, TeamOn Systems, where we provided email access over a mobile device and ultimately over BlackBerry, as we got acquired by BlackBerry in 2002. And BlackBerry in those days, if you're young enough to remember that, was quite an iconic device. In fact, was referred to as Crackberry because it was so addictive. So that was kind of my early foray into mobile, internet, and email.
It'll be interesting to see the number of people who are listening who remember that, but I definitely remember the absolute craze around BlackBerries and the number of devices. It was literally the device to have for a number of years, up until some of the other, obviously, things like the iPhone and other ones came out. But that was the most popular and some of the best things that you could buy as far as mobile devices go. Well, you've written several books, and I want to kind of dive into that as well. The most recent one, Winner Takes All: How Online Marketplaces Are Creating Modern Monopolies. And I'm interested in, maybe you can give us an overview. What is that about, and what drove you to write this book specifically?
Yes. So as the title illustrates, the book is about marketplaces. And what's unique about marketplaces is that it can be a winner take all or winner take most kind of scenario, because as you gain critical mass, network effects kick in, and more consumers join because there are more suppliers join because there are more consumers, and suddenly you have millions of consumers, millions of suppliers interacting with each other, and it becomes very difficult for a new entrant into the market to overcome that advantage. The reason that I wrote the book is because I've been fascinated by marketplaces and was fortunate to have created one with my second company, which was called Livemocha. It was a language learning site, one of the biggest on the internet at that time. And we created a marketplace between language learners and language tutors. We had over 15 million language learners across 200 different countries, and we had over 300,000 language tutors who were eager to teach them how to learn a language. So I got some real good experience working on a marketplace, and I thought that I should share some of those experiences with the readers.
That's really interesting. And especially, having developed and grown a marketplace like that. And I'll be interested, we can talk a little bit more about that. But maybe, as you talk about in the book, you kind of start very early on, especially with digital marketplaces. Obviously, marketplaces have existed for a long, long time, but the history of digital marketplaces is obviously a little bit more recent, and the evolution of those. What you discuss it in the book, but maybe you can give us a little bit of background on the beginnings of some of these digital marketplaces and how they evolved over time.
Right. So it's been very interesting to see the evolution of these marketplaces. You started in what I describe as the listing era, and that encompassed marketplaces like eBay, Taobao in China, Alibaba as well, and then Craigslist was a very popular marketplace. And mostly they were fairly simple in structure. If you wanted to, sell some product on Craigslist, for example, you went there and listed your item, and the buyer had to sort through all the listings, figure out, which listing was attractive, contact the buyer, arrange for shipment, or you go meet that person somewhere to purchase the device, and you had to consummate the purchase yourself. So that was what I call the listings era. And then after that, you had an era that I call the unbundling of Craigslist. So Craigslist is a giant marketplace of multiple individual marketplaces. And so you had vendors or marketplaces like Airbnb is a good example, where they came in and picked apart one segment of Craigslist, which was listing of apartments for rent. Similarly, OfferUp, which is a very popular site for secondhand goods, entered the market and took on Craigslist directly in terms of selling secondhand goods. So that was kind of in the 2005 2010 timeframe, and then finally you had what I call the Uber for X, timeframe, where you had companies like Uber, you had DoorDash, you had Instacart, etc., doing delivery, for the consumers, delivery or ride sharing, in the case of Uber. And the process was a lot more automated than what you found with Craigslist. With Uber, for example, you want to go somewhere, you simply enter the address, and they'll automatically find the driver for you, show you a map of where the driver is, when they'll be arriving, and then once the ride is consummated, then you build automatically. So it's all a very seamless, process. So that's kind of roughly been the evolution of marketplaces, from all the way back in 1995 till today.
It's a really interesting evolution, as we've seen, kind of from the listing, like you said, to the unbundling, to the more end-to-end service, where it's not just unbundled, but you have kind of the complete service for both the suppliers and those who are consuming it. As you kind of allude to in the title, you have this winner takes all or winner takes most, like you said, which we've definitely seen in a number of these marketplaces. For those who may be working on building or growing a marketplace, how does that impact what they're doing, and how can you actually jumpstart or scale a marketplace that may not be the current winner?
Yeah, so there are a number of ways to do that. First of all, I recommend a highly focused approach. Pick one city, one region to get started, and that's what Instacart and DoorDash did. They started in San Francisco. OfferUp started in Seattle. It's a lot easier if you narrow the scope of your initial marketplace. And then the other thing is, as much as possible, focus on getting the supply to the marketplace. And in some instances, you may have to do that even without the permission of the suppliers. So as an example, Instacart, when they got started, the founder, Apurva Mehta, scraped the product content off Safeway's site and published it on his website. And people could then order groceries from those items that were displayed. And then he himself actually went and picked up the groceries and delivered them. So because he wanted to understand the whole end-to-end experience. Same thing with DoorDash. They started off originally in Palo Alto, and they basically took the PDFs of all the restaurant menus and published it on their site. And then they would actually, when somebody called in to place an order, they would then turn around and place the order with the restaurant. And the restaurant didn't even realize that this was being done by a marketplace. And then once they had critical mass, then they went to the restaurants and said, by the way, we've already placed, 100 orders with your restaurant. Why don't you join our platform and become a supplier, supplier on our marketplace? And so that's how you should think about getting started initially.
I think that's great. And a couple of points that you mentioned, like really focusing on a specific segment. So not necessarily targeting every segment or every area, but really being focused. And then you mentioned this in the book, that there's kind of this chicken and egg problem of, who do you bring first? Do you bring the consumers or the users, the buyers, or the suppliers? And you mentioned, focus on the supplier side in order to eventually bring in more and more of the buyers or the consumers or the customers. And so really focusing on, some of those specifics. I'm interested, in the approach that you took building up your company and the marketplace there. What were some of the lessons that you learned from that? And what was kind of your approach and some of the outcomes that you saw from that?
Yeah, so with Livemocha, we focus first on the consumer side in this case, as opposed to the supplier side. So the opposite of what I mentioned before. We had language learning, solutions for multiple languages. So people could come and learn a specific language and then learn from each other. So we could do all of that without really having the language tutors on our platform initially. So we first focused on getting lots of consumers, and we got to about 100,000 users in 3 months, 1 million user in 12 months, and thereon it grew very rapidly. And then once we had all these consumers, then it became a lot easier for us to go and acquire the language tutors, because they saw, hey, this huge volume of language learners in different countries who would want to learn a variety of different languages. And so it became a lot easier at that point to recruit the language tutors to our platform. So each situation is different. You have to analyze, which side is easier to acquire, whether it's, the consumer side or the supplier side, and then go with that strategy.
I think that's a really interesting point. And, kind of going to how you approached it, bringing in a number of the learners in this case for language learning, and which side of that makes the most sense. Obviously, for a lot of companies, it is the supplier side, or bringing the supply. And then in other cases, it may be the opposite. And so really understanding that. As far as the economics of marketplaces, you talk about this in the book, how pricing is different for marketplaces, for whether it's a two-sided or a multi-sided marketplace. How does pricing differ, or how is it different in a marketplace than maybe a traditional pricing for software or services or products?
Because you have multiple sides of the equation, you can make money from both sides, or either side, or just one side. With marketplaces, traditionally, the marketplace will take a cut of the transaction. So the supplier defines the price point, and then the marketplace will take a cut of that price point. But in certain instances, you can have situations where, like with Ticketmaster or StubHub, they will actually take a cut on both sides of the, they will take a cut from the supplier, the provider of the tickets, as well as charge an extra fee to the consumer for the privilege of buying, because they are a monopoly. You end up paying these, outrageous fees to Ticketmaster or StubHub because of the monopoly power that they have. So, it can be very different depending on the whether they're a monopoly, where the money lies, who's paying whom. There are different scenarios in which how money is made in marketplaces.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about that in the book. The different ways of monetizing, or where each of those different areas are, which I think for those building marketplaces is extremely valuable, because it kind of dives into a number of those different areas or ways to think about it. But you mentioned Ticketmaster and StubHub, which I think is really interesting, because they are an effective monopoly on live events, essentially. So whether it's concerts or other things, how do you compete as either a early stage or startup or whatever it is, another marketplace against some of these large marketplaces that exist now? Like, what can what could somebody do in order to compete against a Ticketmaster, StubHub, or more generally, a very dominant player in a certain marketplace?
Yeah, it's very tough because, as I discussed in the book, these marketplaces ultimately become monopolies, and so it's very hard for a startup to get going against them. But there are ways to do that. One is by taking advantage of a technology innovation. So Craigslist, for example, was the marketplace for used goods, and even today has a lot of transactions going through its marketplace. But what happened was OfferUp, which launched in about 2011-12 timeframe. They took advantage of the move to mobile, which Craigslist did not. And so they made it very easy for you to just take a picture of a used item and then publish that on their marketplace. And then they had instant messaging capability where the buyers and the consumers could interact with the suppliers and negotiate on the price, etc., and decide where to meet to buy the item. Whereas with Craigslist, it was a lot more challenging to do that. So they took advantage of technology innovation to disrupt an existing player in the marketplace. But there are other examples. Before StubHub came into the market, Ticketmaster was the sole supplier of live events, but StubHub kind of became their kind of angle was second-hand tickets, or tickets that were being sold by people who already purchased tickets and no longer want to go to the event. And so they found a different niche that they could focus on that Ticketmaster was not focused on. So those are two different strategies. One is take advantage of technology innovation, and the second is to identify a particular niche that the current incumbent is not focused on.
Yeah, I think that's great advice and really interesting to be thinking about it in how not just marketplaces, but how general disruption can happen and where to focus on those specific areas, whether it's an area that's not being well addressed by an existing monopoly, or using some of the new technologies and innovations that are happening in order to leverage that into entering or growing more. But as you've talked about monopolies, I'm interested, and you talk about this in the book as well. Why do some companies or marketplaces become monopolies, and what can or should we do about it? Not just in disrupting, but what are some of the things that we generally should be doing about these large monopolies or large monopoly marketplaces?
Right. So monopolies happen when the marketplaces become very large in terms of consumers and suppliers, and becomes very hard for somebody else to compete with that level of scale. Now, being a monopoly by itself is not bad. What is problematic is where the monopoly takes advantage of it at the expense of suppliers or consumers. So, as an example, Amazon has a private label business. You may have noticed if you want to buy an iPhone cable, then you will see a listing for Amazon Basics, which is their private label brand. And so, at least initially, Amazon promoted its private label business at the expense of other suppliers who were also in that same business. So that is problematic. Another issue that's been problematic is where employees have accessed data about certain suppliers to figure out which markets they should enter into, even though they have an internal policy not to do that, but they were not really policing that effectively. So those are just two examples of how some monopolies like Amazon are taking advantage of their market power. And the way to address that is through regulation. I think Congress has actually done a lot of investigation in this regard. and they need to move forward to have certain rules and regulations. Force Amazon to spin off its private label business, for example, to have strict regulation against accessing supplier data, etc. So that's something that I think is really a regulatory issue that Congress needs to pursue.
And I think you're definitely right, because we see so many of these entrenched monopolies happening, and then ultimately very little to be done. And kind of like you said, that it's not necessarily a problem per se until you see it hurting the suppliers, like in the case of Amazon, taking the data and promote and doing the self promotion within Amazon itself to put theirs above others, and ultimately hurting the suppliers or hurting the consumers, which we've seen in the case of a number of companies. But as we were talking about Ticketmaster and StubHub, those coming very much to mind in not being able to basically do an event without using them, and then them not being able to handle the supply, as we saw like recently with the Taylor Swift concerts and a number of other things, where just hurting the consumers or the customers or the end users. And so needing to really regulate how these develop, and then also what happens after they do, and can we start to pull that apart a little bit in a way that ultimately will benefit everybody, from the suppliers supplying things to the consumers and buyers buying things. I think that that's such an important part.
Absolutely.
I want to step back just a little bit into some of the companies that you've built and the work that you've done, as you have been building companies, and you've been on this entrepreneurial journey for some time. What have been some of the most important things that you have learned in doing that, and building these companies and having some of these successful exits?
Yeah, one key lesson that I learned was to really vet your startup idea. Do some market research, talk to other entrepreneurs, talk to the VC community. Sometimes what happens is that people are really afraid to do that because they feel that somebody might steal their idea. Whereas ideas a dime a dozen. It's really execution that really counts. So I would encourage founders to really go out there and conduct market research to understand, hey, is this a pain point or a need that is really significant and it's worth addressing, and that the existing solutions in the market don't really do a good job of addressing that need or pain point. In my case, for example, with my first company, TeamOn Systems, I made the assumption that small businesses would want a web-based email solution, at that time. Unfortunately, I was a bit early. Today, that's very commonplace, but I was very early at that time. And I could have discovered that through market research. Fortunately, I was able to pivot to a different solution and still succeed, but I could have avoided all that pain and agony.
I think that's such great advice. Yeah. And I'm interested, as you went from that into some of the other ones, how did you go about doing some of that initial research and problem validation before, jumping into some of these other products and companies that you built?
Yeah, so it's several ways. One is identifying potential consumers of my solution, conducting interviews with them. I recommend doing at least 25 to 50 interviews. It can be, time consuming, but I think it's very well worth doing those interviews because you'll get some really great insights. And then what I recommend to people is don't start by showing them your solution and asking them, hey, is this a good solution? Because most people don't want to offend you, and they'll say, yeah, this looks pretty good. Your first question is really about their pain point. Understand what are the critical pain points that they're facing, and if your pain point that you are addressing is in one of those pain points. If it's not, then that's a problem, because even though you might be solving some problem, it's not the top problem that they have that's top of mind, for them. So make sure that you really spend time understanding what their pain points and needs are, how invested they are in current solutions, what it would take for them to migrate from their current solutions to your solution. All of that needs to be discovered before you move forward with your solution.
I agree 100%. And I'm interested too in kind of the next step of that. Like once you have gone through and really validated the problem and the idea, how have you found in your experience that you have really achieved the right solution or found kind of that product market fit? That, you understand the problem and now you've created a solution and this is the right thing. We're going to push this forward. As opposed to iterate or pivot again or anything like that. How have you gone about understanding that you've achieved that product market fit and then really going forward after that?
That's a great question that I again tell a lot of founders that I work with is there is one single metric that will tell you whether you have achieved product market fit, and that's called a retention cohort. And what that means is you track, either every day or every week. You start with, let's say, 100 consumers who come and start using a product. You track those same users over a period of time, and you see how that cohort changes over time and how many people still keep coming back. If you have a very steep curve, that means that people are churning off very rapidly and you don't really have product market fit. Whereas if you have a fairly flat curve, that's a really good sign that you have product market fit and that consumers are coming back time and time again to use your product. So that single metric alone is the most important metric that you need to focus on as a founder.
I think that's absolutely spot on. I love that. I'm interested too in what other advice or what advice do you have for people who are looking to either get into product management like early in your career or into starting their own companies and a startup or another entrepreneurial venture?
The main thing I emphasize to people is leverage your expertise. The really successful founders have some expertise, some insight into some market, and they see the technology trends that are influencing the market. They understand what issues customers are facing, etc. Those are some of the best companies that I like to personally invest in, is founders who have a deep understanding of a specific market and a pain point that allows them to understand what kind of a solution you need to develop for that market. So that's what I suggest to people is if you have that insight, then absolutely you should go, do a startup because you can leverage that keen insight into building something that's really valuable and that will become someday a large company. I don't worry so much about how the size of the market, because over time that market will expand. Facebook, for example, started with college students, right? But that was not ultimately their market. The market was the entire world. But sometimes it's important to start with a niche focus and really master that market before expanding your horizons. So again, see if you have some deep insight that allows you to build a unique solution and then go pursue that dream with a startup.
That's absolutely great. This has been a really, really great conversation. I have a couple of wrap-up questions before we finish up. But was there anything that we talked about or didn't get a chance to talk about that you wanted to add in?
Yeah, a couple of things that I mentioned in my book one is about building trust in the marketplace. Very, very important because in a new marketplace, consumers are often reluctant to consummate transactions. So, having a review rating system is important. Having insurance of some kind like Uber and Airbnb provide, that's important. Having generous return policies, all of these things are important to creating trust. And then the the other thing that I want to emphasize is that be careful about how much you charge the different participants in the marketplace, because if you charge too much, as Apple and Google have done, for example, they charge 30% for App Store participants. That can create a lot of noise and dissatisfaction, and ultimately, you'll be the target of regulators who will want to regulate what you can charge and so forth. So don't be too greedy just because you have monopoly power. Be fair, and still be obviously profitable. But be careful about how much you take from the different participants.
Yeah, I think that those are excellent points about building trust and how you can do it within a marketplace. And then also, like Google used to say, don't be evil about
exactly.
it. Especially when you're in a position that you can be. And we've definitely seen, the fallout of that for Apple and Google, and we'll probably continue to see the fallout. But the fact of taking a 30% cut from their app stores is something that just does not sit well anymore. Awesome. Well, Shirish, before we kind of wrap up with a couple final questions, where can people find out more about you, about the things that you're working on, and about the books that you have written?
Probably the best way is to go to my personal website, which is shirishnadkarni.com. You'll find on that site, you'll also find my LinkedIn profile, as well as my Twitter handle. So I'm very active on both LinkedIn and Twitter, and I welcome people to connect with me. And I'm happy to advise startup founders, whatever needs they have. So the best way to reach out to me is probably through LinkedIn. So just search for my name and you'll find it on LinkedIn.
Yeah, well, we'll put those links in the show notes as well, so you can check those out from this episode. All right, Shirish, we usually ask everybody a couple of wrap-up questions, and these don't have to be necessarily professional related. Open it up to anything. But have you read or watched or listened to anything recently that you found particularly interesting?
Yeah, I read this book called No Rules by Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix. It's an amazing book. It talks about their culture and how they manage people. Essentially, their philosophy is to not for managers not to poke their nose in everything that their employees do, but to really let them thrive and succeed on their own. And it's a very compelling argument. So I highly recommend that book if people want to read it.
That's great. Yeah, we'll put the link to that in the show notes as well. There've been a lot of really, really good insights that I think have come out of Netflix and the way they built that company and the culture over the years. I know there's a number of really good books, and I haven't read that one, but I'm going to put it on my list so I can read that one as well. It sounds really good. All right. And then finally, are there any products or applications or anything that you've been using recently that you want to call out? It could be digital or physical products, anything.
Yeah. So I love my AirPod Pros. The reason I love them is because I go for long walks. And I love listening to podcasts. I love listening to audiobooks, and I can get a lot done simply by putting those AirPods in. Especially the noise canceling features are pretty good and allows me to get a lot done while I'm enjoying nature.
Definitely. Yeah, those are good ones. We get a number of call outs for AirPods on this podcast, and it's for obviously good reason.
Yeah.
Well, Shirish, this has been an amazing conversation. I appreciate all of your insight, both on product management, on technology, on entrepreneurship, and especially on the book, Winner Takes All, on marketplaces and monopolies. This has been very, very insightful and absolutely amazing conversation.
Thank you, Kyle. It's been a great conversation, and look forward to seeing the podcast.
Look forward to everybody listening to this, and appreciate all of you listening as well. We'll talk again next time. Thanks again for listening. If you like the show, be sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can follow the show on TikTok at prodigy.co and on Twitter at prodigyco. You can also follow me on both of those platforms at Kyle Larry Evans. If you want more product conversation, check out my newsletter Prodigy at prodigy.co. You can also follow me on Medium at Kyle Larry Evans, or check out my Medium publication Prodigy. Of course, you can check out all these links in the show notes.